Welcome to Paper Trail, where we make academic research accessible and engaging. Let's see what the evidence says.
The monthly jobs report is one of those economic announcements that consistently grabs headlines. Markets react, pundits speculate, and policymakers often point to it as a key indicator of economic health. But what if the numbers we're all reacting to aren't actually telling the full story?
That's precisely what a recent NBR working paper suggests. The researchers looked closely at the Employment Situation Report and found something quite striking. The initial, widely reported figures often miss critical economic turning points, especially when the economy is shifting gears. It's the revisions to these reports that tend to reveal the true state of affairs.
So the immediate snapshot we get, the one everyone talks about on release day, is essentially a noisy signal, and the real insight only emerges later, sometimes months down the line. That's a pretty fundamental challenge to how we perceive these announcements.
It is. The paper argues that by the time the data is fully revised and stabilized, the picture of the economy can look significantly different from what was initially presented. This isn't just about small tweaks. It can be about missing a recession's onset or a recovery's acceleration in real time.
That's a crucial distinction because it implies that the understanding of economic shifts and potentially the policy responses to them could be based on incomplete or even misleading information for a significant period.
Exactly. Think of it like trying to navigate a dense fog. You get immediate readings, but they're hazy. It's only when the fog lifts that you truly see the landscape, but by then, you might have already made some turns based on those blurry initial impressions. The paper dives deep into why this happens and what the implications are.
So, regarding the report itself, what exactly is referred to as the jobs report, and what are its main components that generate these figures?
Primarily, the discussion centers on the Employment Situation Report, which is released monthly by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's actually a composite of two major surveys. The first is the Current Population Survey, or CPS, which is a household survey. This is the source of the unemployment rate. It's a survey of about 60,000 households.
And that's distinct from the one that provides the headline number of jobs created or lost.
Correct. That headline number, the non-farm payrolls, comes from the Current Employment Statistics, or CES, which is an establishment survey. It surveys about 119,000 businesses and government agencies, covering approximately 629,000 individual worksites. This survey counts the number of paid employees on non-farm payrolls. It's a much larger sample size focused on employers.
So there are two different surveys, collected differently, measuring slightly different things, yet they both feed into this single, highly anticipated monthly report. How quickly does this data become available, and how final is it when it's first released?
The initial release is quite rapid, usually the first Friday of the month following the reference period. But that final part is key. The initial release is actually quite preliminary. It's based on incomplete data returns and includes estimates for missing information. The BLS then revises these numbers twice in the subsequent months as more complete data comes in. So, for example, the January report is first released in early February, then revised in early March and early April.
And it's these revisions that the researchers highlight as being so significant. They're not just minor tweaks then.
Not at all. The paper's core finding is that these revisions are not trivial, especially in economically sensitive periods. They found that revisions are often large enough to change the narrative about the economy's direction. For instance, an initial report might show a slowing job market, suggesting a potential downturn, but subsequent revisions could reveal robust job growth. Or, conversely, an initial positive report could be revised downward, indicating a weaker economy than first perceived.
So how often do these revisions actually alter the qualitative assessment of the economy? Do they frequently flip the story from good to bad or bad to good?
The paper indicates that the revisions can indeed be substantial enough to change the interpretation of economic trends, particularly around turning points. They analyze decades of data and observe that real-time estimates of payroll employment often misrepresent the initial phase of recessions or recoveries. It's not just the magnitude of the revisions, but their directional implications. A month that initially looked like modest growth might, after revisions, appear to be a contraction, or vice versa.
This brings up an interesting point about the signal-to-noise ratio. If the initial data is so noisy, why is so much weight placed on it by society? Why do markets react so strongly to numbers that are essentially provisional?
That's a great question, and it speaks to the challenge of real-time economic assessment. There's an immense demand for timely information, even if it's imperfect. Financial markets thrive on new information, and even a preliminary jobs report offers the most current snapshot available. The problem is that acting on that noisy signal can lead to misallocated resources or inappropriate policy decisions. The researchers effectively argue that the signal in the initial release is often weaker than the noise.
So policymakers, economists, and even average citizens are making decisions or forming opinions based on data that hasn't fully materialized yet. How significant is this delay in getting the true picture?
The paper demonstrates that the delay can be critical. The turning points in the economy, the start or end of a recession, for example, are often only clearly identifiable after the revisions have occurred. This means that during the actual real-time experience of a recession starting or ending, the initial jobs reports might still be painting a misleadingly stable or even opposite picture. By the time the revised data confirms the turning point, several months have often passed, and the economy has already moved significantly.
Can you give a concrete example of this phenomenon where the initial report was misleading about a major economic shift?
Certainly. The paper points to the onset of the Great Recession in late 2007. Initial payroll employment reports in the months leading up to and into the recession's start were often positive or only slightly negative, suggesting continued job growth or just a slowdown. However, once the data was fully revised, it became clear that significant job losses had begun much earlier than initially reported. The same pattern was observed during the dot-com bust recession in 2001. Real-time data significantly underestimated the severity of job losses at the beginning of that downturn.
That's quite profound. It's like trying to diagnose a patient using symptoms from last week's checkup when their condition has deteriorated since. The initial data was essentially obscuring the gravity of the situation.
Exactly. And it's not just downturns. The researchers also found instances where the initial reports were overly pessimistic during the early stages of a recovery, only for revisions to show stronger job creation than first thought. It works both ways. The real-time data just doesn't have the fidelity to accurately capture these inflection points.
What explains this systematic discrepancy between initial estimates and revised figures? Is it purely about more complete data coming in, or are there other factors at play?
It's primarily about the data collection process and the statistical methods used. A big part is simply that the initial report is based on incomplete survey returns. Not all businesses respond by the deadline for the first release. As more responses come in over the next 2 months, the BLS can fill in those gaps and refine their estimates.
So, it's a bit like a jigsaw puzzle where you're trying to describe the image after only having a third of the pieces. Then more pieces arrive later, allowing you to see the full picture.
A good analogy. Another significant factor is what's called the birth-death model adjustment. The CES survey, which provides the non-farm payrolls, can't capture jobs created by new businesses or jobs lost by businesses that recently closed, because these aren't yet in the survey sampling frame. So the BLS uses a model to estimate these job gains and losses. This model is based on historical trends and can be less accurate during periods of rapid economic change when patterns deviate from the norm. That makes sense. During a recession, more businesses might be closing than the model predicts, and during a recovery, more might be opening. So the model's assumptions could lead to systematic errors in real time.
Precisely. And there are also seasonal adjustments. Employment data has strong seasonal patterns. Think holiday hiring or summer jobs for students. The BLS adjusts the raw data to remove these predictable seasonal fluctuations to reveal the underlying trend. But these seasonal factors themselves can sometimes be tricky to estimate accurately in real time, especially if the current economic cycle is unusual. Subsequent revisions often refine these seasonal adjustments.
Given these challenges and the consistent pattern of revisions, what do the researchers suggest for how financial markets, policymakers, and economists should interpret and use the initial jobs report?
The paper doesn't advocate for ignoring the initial report entirely, as it's still the earliest comprehensive look available. However, it strongly emphasizes the need for caution and skepticism. The key takeaway is that initial announcements should be treated as highly provisional estimates, not definitive statements about the economy. They carry a significant margin of error and a strong likelihood of revision.
So the advice is essentially don't overreact to the first number. Wait for the revisions before drawing firm conclusions about economic trends or turning points.
That's the crux of it. The researchers argue that real-time policymakers and market participants should be less confident about the initial payroll figures, especially during periods of economic uncertainty or when indicators suggest a potential shift. They highlight that the revised data consistently provides a more accurate and timely identification of economic turning points than the initial real-time estimates.
This implies a kind of slow economics approach, where patience and a willingness to update one's understanding are paramount, rather than chasing the immediate headline. But that's a difficult ask in a 24/7 news cycle and fast-moving financial markets.
It is a challenge. The paper acknowledges the tension between the demand for immediacy and the need for accuracy. Their analysis, however, underscores that the revised series are far more reliable for understanding the true path of the economy. For analysts, it suggests looking at a broader array of coincident indicators and perhaps even giving greater weight to the direction of revisions over several months, rather than just the initial number.
What kind of practical implications does this have for, say, a central bank making interest rate decisions or a government considering fiscal stimulus?
For central banks, it means being acutely aware that their real-time decisions might be based on a potentially misleading signal about the labor market. If they're waiting for definitive signs of a downturn or recovery, those signs might only become clear in the revised data, by which point their policy response could be delayed or miscalibrated. For governments, it means recognizing that the public perception of economic health, which often influences policy support, could be based on a partial truth. This knowledge might encourage more robust scenario planning or a more cautious communication strategy around economic data releases.
Is there any way to improve the initial signal? Are the researchers suggesting methodological changes to the BLS surveys, or is this just an inherent limitation of trying to capture such a complex, dynamic system in real time? The paper primarily focuses on diagnosing the problem and its implications rather than proposing specific BLS methodological changes, though it implicitly highlights areas for potential improvement. Some of these issues, like the birth-death model or the challenge of incomplete data returns, are inherent difficulties in conducting large-scale surveys rapidly. It's tough to get complete, accurate data almost instantly without some degree of estimation. However, greater transparency around the expected magnitude and direction of revisions, or even reporting a wider confidence interval for the initial release, could help manage expectations. It sounds like the key lesson here is a call for intellectual humility when interpreting economic data, especially when it's fresh off the press. Precisely. It's about understanding the process behind the numbers and acknowledging their provisional nature. The real jobs report isn't just the one released on the first Friday of the month. It's the evolving story that unfolds as the data matures. The paper serves as a valuable reminder that economic analysis requires patience and a deep appreciation for the statistical complexities involved. So, if there are a few things listeners should really take away from this research, what would they be? First, the initial jobs report is often a noisy signal, not a definitive statement, especially regarding economic turning points. Second, the revisions are not just minor tweaks. They frequently alter the qualitative assessment of economic health and direction. And third, the fully revised data consistently provides a more accurate and timely identification of economic turning points than what's available in real time. That certainly changes how one might view those headline numbers. For listeners trying to make sense of economic news, this suggests a need for a longer perspective. Absolutely. It means acknowledging the inherent uncertainty in early economic data and developing a habit of looking beyond the immediate headlines to the underlying trends as they solidify. So, the next time a major jobs report drops and the headlines scream about millions of jobs gained or lost, the question to ask might not be what happened, but what might have happened and what will the revisions tell us a few months from now?
That's precisely the more rigorous approach the paper encourages.
That wraps up this episode of Paper Trail. Join us next time as we dig into more research worth talking about. If you liked what you heard, share it with a friend.
Keep reading the fine print.